How do contrails affect the climate? This matters because contrails and increased cloudiness trap heat emitted by Earth, leading to a net increase in temperature on our planet, he adds. This warming comes on top of aviation's other major impact on the climate, the huge amounts of CO2 emitted by their emissions, contributing to around 2.5% of global CO2 emissions. But the impact of contrails on the climate is much more complex than that of the CO2 emissions in question. In the 1960s, papers began to be published noting that contrails could have a cooling effect on Earth, Schumann says. This is because the whiteness of clouds caused by contrails reflects sunlight away from the Earth's surface during the day, in a similar way to natural cirrus clouds, which are also composed of ice crystals. However, scientists soon realized that contrails can also have a warming effect on Earth, through a greenhouse effect that captures infrared light. They capture the heat emitted from the Earth's surface and emit some of it back to the surface, says Schumann. It's similar to how cloudy skies create warmer nights. Clouds overhead trap some of the outgoing heat, although the contrails aren't large enough to cause changes in the weather on the ground. Depending on the exact circumstances, one or the other of these opposing effects may prevail. For example, contrails forming over a snowy landscape do not result in additional cooling from the reflection of sunlight because the surface is already white and reflective. Contrails also heat up more at night because not enough solar radiation is reflected off them, so only the heating effect plays a role. Along with the difficulty of understanding the exact atmospheric conditions in which contrails form, and the difficulty of differentiating them from natural cirrus clouds when they spread across the sky, all of this makes it complicated to put firm numbers on the impact of contrails on the climate. However, the current understanding is that, on average across all countries around the world, over a year, contrails warm up, says Schumann. The last major paper on the climate impacts of contrails, published in 2020, estimates that non-CO2 aviation impacts, dominated by contrails, lead to 3 times the radiation caused by CO2 emissions alone. In some ways it's a difficult comparison because the warming effects of contrails and CO2 occur on very different timescales. Contrails have a very strong propellant effect, much stronger than CO2. But contrails are short-lived, disappearing after an hour or so. While CO2 is long-lived, it can live for 100 years, says Schumann. Nevertheless, scientists have warned that the heat-generating effect of contrail clouds could triple by 2050 if action is not taken. The good news is that this could actually be a fairly simple thing to deal with. The researchers showed that just 2.2% of flights contribute 80% of this pressure, and that relatively small adjustments to the altitudes of these flights, at little fuel cost, could greatly reduce the heating effect of contrails. Contrail formation can also be reduced by reducing the amount of soot particles emitted by flights, research has shown, as these provide the nuclei for ice crystal formation. Avoiding flying through very moist air, where persistent contrails can form, is the most important measure here, Schumann says, when flying over, under or around these areas. To facilitate this, however, better weather forecasts are needed, he says. The weather forecasts we have today are not accurate enough for this purpose. In a letter to the journal Nature last year, 2 researchers argued that adjusting flight altitudes to minimize contrail formation could be one of the most cost-effective climate measures. They calculated that preventing the most damaging contrails would cost $1 billion a year, with a benefit worth more than 1,000 times that amount.